The metallic clang echoed across the muddy field somewhere in the rolling countryside of eastern France. It was November 1944, and the sound of Corporal James "Jimmy" Thornton's makeshift welding torch competed with distant artillery fire that rumbled like an approaching thunderstorm. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, burnt metal, and the damp earth that seemed to permeate everything in this endless autumn campaign. Around him, several tank crew members stood watching, some with arms crossed, others shaking their heads. The laughter had started about 20 minutes earlier when Jimmy first proposed his solution to the broken track link on their M4 Sherman tank, call sign Iron Betty. "You can't be serious, Thornton," said Sergeant Bill McKenzie, wiping grease from his hands onto an already filthy rag. "That's not going to hold for more than 5 minutes once we get moving." Jimmy didn't look up from his work. His hands, blackened with oil and soot, carefully positioned the makeshift welding apparatus he'd cobbled together from spare parts, a damaged acetylene torch from a knocked-out vehicle, and what some of the men were calling pure stubbornness. The problem was simple enough to understand, but difficult to solve. During their advance through the Vosges Mountains region, Iron Betty had thrown a track. One of the connecting links, the crucial pins that held the massive steel track segments together, had sheared clean through. Without it, the 30-ton Sherman was as useful as a steel coffin on this muddy battlefield. Standard procedure would be to call for a recovery vehicle and replacement parts. But standard procedure assumed you had time, resources, and weren't positioned in a forward area where German forces were known to be regrouping for a counterattack. They had none of those luxuries. "Listen," Jimmy said, finally pausing to look at his skeptical audience, "we can sit here and wait for parts that might not come for 2 days, or we can try this. I've done welding work before the war. I know what I'm doing." "Welding farm equipment is one thing," chimed in Private Lou Dexter, the assistant driver. "But a tank track under combat stress? That's gonna snap the moment we hit rough terrain." The truth was, they all knew their situation was precarious. Their company, part of the 2nd Armored Division, had pushed forward aggressively, perhaps too aggressively. They were now in a salient, a bulge in the American lines that protruded dangerously into contested territory. Intel reports suggested German forces were massing for a counteroffensive, and their position, while strategically valuable, was also vulnerable. Captain Robert Hayes, their company commander, had visited their position an hour earlier. His face was drawn, the weight of command evident in every line. "I need every tank operational," he'd said. "If they come at us, we're going to need every gun we have." Jimmy remembered the captain's words as he worked. The makeshift welding setup wasn't pretty, but it was functional. He'd scavenged parts from damaged vehicles in their assembly area, including pieces from a destroyed German half-track. The irony wasn't lost on him that enemy equipment might help save American lives. The repair itself was unorthodox. Instead of simply trying to weld the broken pin back together, which everyone agreed would never hold, Jimmy had fabricated a reinforced sleeve system. He'd cut and shaped metal plates, creating a housing that would fit around the damaged link. The sleeve would be welded to both the track link and the pin, distributing stress across a larger area. "Even if the weld holds," McKenzie said, still skeptical, "that whole assembly is going to be weak. First rock we hit, first hard turn, and boom, we're immobilized again." "Maybe," Jimmy conceded, "but maybe it'll hold long enough to matter." The welding process was painstaking. Jimmy had to heat the metal carefully, ensuring proper fusion without compromising the integrity of the track link itself. Too hot, and he'd weakened the original metal. Too cold, and the weld wouldn't bond properly. The acetylene torch, damaged as it was, produced an inconsistent flame that required constant adjustment. As he worked, the sounds of war continued their distant percussion. American artillery units were firing harassment rounds, trying to disrupt German movements and preparations. Somewhere to the north, the distinctive burp of German MG-42 machine guns could be heard, answered by the slower, steadier beat of American Brownings. The crew of Iron Betty was a mixed group, like most American tank crews. Jimmy Thornton himself was from rural Ohio, where his family ran a small farm and machine shop. He'd grown up fixing tractors and equipment, learning that necessity often mothered the most creative solutions. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, their tank commander, was a former school teacher from Massachusetts. He was younger than most of his crew, having received a battlefield commission after the previous lieutenant was wounded during the fighting in Normandy. Webb had learned to trust his men's expertise, especially when it came to mechanical matters. Staff Sergeant Harvey "Heavy" Morrison was their gunner, a former steel worker from Pittsburgh who'd handled industrial equipment before the war. His nickname came not from his build, which was actually quite lean, but from his habit of using overwhelming firepower to solve problems. When in doubt, he'd say, "Send more lead downrange." The loader, Private First Class Danny Chen, was the youngest of them all, barely 20 years old. His family had immigrated from China to California, where they ran a restaurant in San Francisco. Danny had joined up right after Pearl Harbor, determined to prove his loyalty to his adopted country. His speed and efficiency in loading the 75mm shells had saved their lives more than once. And then there was Lou Dexter, the assistant driver, a wisecracking former mechanic from Detroit who'd worked on the automobile assembly lines before being drafted. Lou and Jimmy often butted heads over repair techniques, with Lou favoring by-the-book solutions and Jimmy preferring improvisation. As the afternoon wore on, Jimmy continued his work. The temperature was dropping, and a light rain began to fall, creating a miserable mist that clung to everything. The moisture made welding even more challenging, as he had to keep the work area dry enough for proper bonding. "This is crazy," Lou muttered. "Not for the first time. Even if this holds, there's no way it'll stand up to combat conditions." Lieutenant Webb, who'd been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "Corporal Thornton, give me your honest assessment. What are the chances this repair holds?" Jimmy paused, considering his answer carefully. "Sir, under ideal conditions with proper materials and equipment, I'd give it maybe a 40% chance. With what we've got here, in this weather, with this makeshift setup, I'd say 25, maybe 30%. And without this repair, we're dead in the water, sir. 0% chance of being mobile." Webb nodded slowly. "Then we go with what we've got. Finish the work, Corporal." The laughter had stopped by then, replaced by a tense silence. The men understood what was at stake. An immobilized tank was a target, nothing more. If German forces did launch their expected counterattack, Iron Betty and her crew would be sitting ducks. As darkness began to fall, Jimmy finally completed his work. The repair was ugly, a bulky mass of welded metal that looked nothing like the smooth, factory-made components it replaced. But as he tested the assembly, checking for play and movement, he felt a cautious optimism. It might just work. "All right," Webb announced, "let's button up and test it. Morrison, you've got the turret. Everyone else, mount up." The crew climbed aboard Iron Betty, taking their positions in the familiar cramped interior. The smell inside was distinctly Sherman, a mixture of oil, cordite from expended shells, sweat, and the metallic tang of steel. Despite months in combat, none of them had gotten entirely used to it. Webb gave the order, and their driver, Corporal Eddie Santos, a quiet man from Texas, who hadn't been part of the earlier discussion, started the engine. The Continental R975 radial engine coughed to life, its distinctive sound a comforting rumble. "Take it slow, Santos," Webb instructed through the intercom. "Nice and easy." The Sherman lurched forward, and everyone held their breath. The track engaged, the repaired link moving through the drive sprocket. Once, twice, 3 times, no failure. Santos increased speed slightly, and Iron Betty began moving more confidently across the muddy ground. They drove in a wide circle, testing turns and backing up. The repair held. "I'll be damned," Mackenzie said, genuine surprise in his voice. "Don't celebrate yet," Jimmy cautioned. "This was just on flat ground, low speed. We won't know how it really performs until we hit rough terrain or combat conditions. Let's hope we don't have to find out," Webb said, but there was little conviction in his voice. They all knew what was coming. That night, as the crew took turns on watch, intelligence reports confirmed their fears. German forces had indeed been massing for a counteroffensive. Elements of the 11th Panzer Division, equipped with Panther and Panzer IV tanks, had been identified in the area. The attack was expected to come at dawn. The plan was straightforward, but brutal. American forces would attempt to hold their current positions for as long as possible, bleeding the German advance and allowing reinforcements to establish defensive positions further back. It was a delaying action, the kind of operation where success was measured not in ground gained, but in time bought and casualties inflicted. Iron Betty's platoon was positioned on the left flank of the American line in a small village called Saint-Maurice-au-Forge. The name meant Saint Maurice at the Forge, a reference to the medieval ironworking that had once been the village's lifeblood. Now it was about to become a battlefield. The village itself was typical of the region. Stone buildings clustered around a small church, narrow streets, and surrounding fields bordered by low stone walls. The Americans had spent the evening preparing defensive positions, creating firing lanes and establishing fallback points. Jimmy spent much of the night checking and rechecking his repair. By flashlight, he examined the welds, looking for any signs of stress or cracking. Everything appeared solid, but the real test would come under fire. As the first gray light of dawn began to illuminate the eastern sky, the German artillery started. The bombardment began with a few ranging shots, followed by a concentrated barrage that fell on the American positions like the wrath of an angry god. Shells screamed overhead, exploding in eruptions of dirt, stone, and shrapnel. Inside Iron Betty, the crew waited in tense silence. The tank's armor could withstand artillery fragments, but a direct hit from a heavy shell could penetrate even their steel protection. "All tanks, this is Sabre 6, Captain Hayes' voice came over the radio. "Enemy armor approaching from the northeast. Estimate 15 to 20 vehicles, mixed Panthers and Mark IVs. Infantry following. Engage at will but conserve ammunition. We need to make every shot count." Webb acknowledged the transmission and addressed his crew. "You heard the captain. Chen, load armor piercing. Morrison, you're cleared to engage once we have targets. Santos, keep us mobile and ready to displace." "Understood, sir," came the acknowledgments. The first German tanks appeared through the morning mist like gray ghosts. Panthers, their distinctive sloped armor unmistakable even at distance. These were formidable opponents. The Panther's long 75mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges where the Sherman's gun was largely ineffective. American tank doctrine acknowledged this disparity. Sherman's relied on numbers, maneuverability, and tactical positioning rather than armor or firepower. The goal was to flank enemy tanks, hitting their weaker side armor, or to work in teams to overwhelm individual targets. "Target Panther, 11 o'clock, 800 yard. Webb called out. Morrison tracked the target through his gun sight. "Identified." "Wait for it," Webb cautioned. "Let them get closer. We need to make this first shot count." The tension inside the tank was palpable. Everyone knew their vulnerability. One penetrating hit from a Panther could transform their steel haven into a burning coffin in seconds. At 600 yards, Webb gave the order. "Fire!" Morrison squeezed the trigger. The 75mm gun roared, the entire tank rocking backward from the recoil. The armor-piercing round streaked toward its target, a hit. The shell struck the Panther's frontal armor but ricocheted off, the German tank's superior armor doing its job. "No penetration," Morrison reported, already tracking for a follow-up shot. "Chen, reload." "Same ammunition," Webb ordered. The dance had begun. Across the battlefield, American and German tanks engaged in deadly exchanges. Tracers from machine guns stitched through the air. Explosions marked successful hits and near misses. The acrid smell of cordite filled Iron Betty's interior as they continued firing. The German advance was methodical and professional. Their tanks moved in mutually supporting groups, with infantry following in half-tracks and on foot. American positions began taking casualties, and several Shermans were hit, some brewing up in the distinctive fires that had earned the Sherman the grim nickname Ronson, after the cigarette lighter that boasted "Lights first time, every time." Iron Betty fought on, Webb expertly maneuvering the tank to different firing positions, never staying in one place long enough for German gunners to zero in on them. Jimmy's repair held through the movement, the repaired track link continuing to function despite the stress of combat maneuvering. They scored 2 confirmed hits, both on the lighter Panzer IV tanks, which lacked the Panther's heavy armor. Each successful engagement was a small victory, but the overall situation was deteriorating. "Sabre 6 to all units," Hayes' voice came through, slightly distorted by static. "Execute withdrawal plan Alpha. Leapfrog back to phase line Bravo. Acknowledge." One by one, tank commanders acknowledged the order. The withdrawal would be conducted in stages, with half the tanks covering while the others fell back, then switching roles. It was a dangerous maneuver that required discipline and coordination. "Sabre 2-3, this is Sabre 6. Hayes' voice was directed at another tank in their platoon. "You're our rear guard. cover the withdrawal. Sabre 6, 2-3 is immobilized. Took a hit to our transmission. We're not going anywhere. A pause, then Hayes' voice, heavy with the weight of command. Understood, 2-3, Godspeed. The implications were clear. The immobilized tank would stay behind, buying time with their lives. Webb looked around at his crew. All right, we're pulling back with the first group. Santos, reverse course toward the radio crackled again. Sabre 6, Sabre 2-3, they're flanking our position. We can't hold them. Crew is bailing out. Without the rear guard, the German forces would be able to pursue the retreating Americans more aggressively, potentially turning a controlled withdrawal into a rout. Webb made a decision that would define everything that followed. Sabre 6, this is Iron Betty. We'll cover the withdrawal. There was a long pause before Hayes responded. Iron Betty, you're sure about this? Affirmative, Sabre 6. We'll hold this position and slow them down. Just make sure the rest of the company gets clear. Another pause. Copy that, Iron Betty. Good luck, Marcus. Webb switched to intercom. All right, crew, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. We're staying behind to give everyone else time to withdraw. I won't order any of you to stay. If anyone wants to bail out and try to make it back on foot, I'll understand. Silence filled the tank for a moment. Then Heavy Morrison spoke up. Sir, with all due respect, who's going to load for me if Chen leaves? And if he stays, who's going to tell him where to go? I'm not letting some college professor get us all lost. Despite the tension, there was a brief moment of laughter. Chen's voice came next. Besides, somebody needs to make sure Heavy doesn't waste all our ammunition shooting at trees. Lou Dexter chimed in, and Santos can't drive this thing without me making sure he doesn't get us stuck in a ditch. Santos, who rarely spoke, simply said, I'm staying. Finally, Jimmy spoke. Sir, if we're going to be doing a lot of maneuvering, someone needs to keep an eye on that track repair. I should probably stick around. Webb's voice was thick with emotion when he responded. All right then, let's make this count. Iron Betty repositioned to a spot that offered good fields of fire and some cover from a partially collapsed stone barn. From here, they could engage German forces while using the terrain to limit their exposure. The next hour was the longest of their lives. They watched as the rest of their company conducted their withdrawal, tanks leapfrogging back under the covering fire of their comrades. German forces, realizing what was happening, pressed their attack more aggressively. Iron Betty became the focal point of German attention. Webb and Morrison worked in perfect synchrony, identifying targets and engaging them with precision. Chen's speed in loading kept their rate of fire high. Santos performed a deadly ballet, moving Iron Betty to new positions every few shots, never staying in one place long enough to become an easy target. And through it all, Jimmy's repair held. The track that everyone had laughed at, that cobbled-together mass of welded metal and improvisation, continued to function. Each time Santos threw the tank into reverse, each sharp turn, each abrupt acceleration, the repair bore the stress and held firm. They knocked out 3 more German tanks, 2 Panthers and another Panzer IV. The Panthers had been the hardest, requiring multiple hits from different angles. Morrison had shown remarkable skill, waiting for moments when the German tanks turned slightly, presenting their thinner side armor. But the Germans weren't giving up. They brought up infantry with anti-tank weapons, and artillery began falling closer to Iron Betty's position. Near misses showered the tank with debris and shrapnel. Sir, the company should be clear by now, Heavy reported, having kept track of the withdrawal timeline. Webb knew he was right. They'd done their job, bought the necessary time. Now came the hardest part, getting out themselves. All right, Santos, plot us a course back to our lines. We're going to have to move fast. The withdrawal began well enough. Santos backed Iron Betty out of their position and began moving at speed toward the American lines. But the Germans, perhaps sensing their prey was escaping, redoubled their effort. A Panther emerged from behind a building less than 400 yards away. It was a point-blank shot by tank standards, and the German crew didn't hesitate. The Panther's gun fired. The shell struck Iron Betty's right side, penetrating the thinner side armor. The impact was catastrophic. Inside the tank, the world became noise, fire, and smoke. The shell had struck near the turret basket, and fragments filled the fighting compartment. Santos was hit by shrapnel, but conscious. Lou Dexter took the worst of it, fragments catching him in the chest and arm. He slumped in his seat, gasping. "Bail out! Bail out!" Webb shouted, but even as he gave the order, he knew Lou couldn't move on his own. Heavy Morrison and Danny Chen scrambled out of the turret. Jimmy, in the hull, tried to help Lou, but the assistant driver driver waved him off. "Go," Lou gasped. "Get out of here." "Not leaving you, Lou," Jimmy said, working to free him from his station. Webb, meanwhile, had remained in the tank, engaging the Panther with the Bull machine gun, trying to suppress the German crew while his men evacuated. The Panther fired again, but the shot went high, striking the turret and jamming the main gun. With Lou free from his station, Jimmy began dragging him toward the escape hatch. Santos, despite his wounds, helped push from behind. The smoke inside the tank was thickening, and small fires had started from damaged electrical systems. They got Lou out through the hull escape hatch, and Heavy and Chen helped pull him clear of the tank. Webb emerged last, smoke-stained and bleeding from a small head wound. The crew, all together and alive, took cover behind a low stone wall about 50 yards from Iron Betty. German infantry was advancing, and the Panther was repositioning for a final shot on the immobilized Sherman. "We need to move," Webb said. "Lou, can you walk?" Lou, pale and struggling to breathe, nodded. "I'll manage, sir." But as they prepared to move, Heavy pointed back toward Iron Betty. "Sir, the ammunition." They all understood immediately. Iron Betty still had shells in her racks, dozens of them. If the tank burned hot enough, those shells would cook off, exploding and sending fragments in all directions. Anyone in the vicinity, American or German, would be in danger. More immediately, the tank's position would prevent German forces from using that route during their continued advance. If Iron Betty exploded at the right moment, it might even catch German forces in the blast. Webb looked at the tank, then at his crew. "Morrison, you and Chen get Lou back to our lines. Santos, Dexter, help them." "Sir?" Jimmy asked, already knowing what the lieutenant was thinking. "Someone needs to make sure that tank goes up at the right time. I'm going back." "Not alone, you're not," Jimmy said immediately. "Corporal, that's..." "Sir, with respect, you're wounded, and I know that tank better than anyone right now. You're going to need help." They argued for precious seconds before Webb relented. "Fine, everyone else get moving. We'll catch up." Heavy and Chen helped Lou to his feet, and Santos, despite his own wounds, supported Lou on the other side. They began making their way back toward American lines, using whatever cover the terrain provided. Webb and Jimmy sprinted back to Iron Betty. German small arms fire kicked up dirt around them, but they made it to the tank and climbed inside. The smoke was worse now, and flames had spread to some of the internal padding and stored equipment. "We need to position some shells near the engine compartment," Webb said, coughing. "The heat there will set them off." They worked quickly but carefully, pulling several 75mm shells from their racks and placing them where the growing fire would reach them. It was nerve-wracking work, handling high-explosive ammunition in a burning tank. "That should do it," Webb said. "Let's go." They climbed out and had made it about 20 yards when Webb stumbled and fell. Jimmy turned back and saw blood spreading across the lieutenant's leg. "Must have caught some shrapnel I didn't feel," Webb said, his face gray. "Go on, Corporal. I'll catch up." "Like hell," Jimmy said, grabbing Webb's arm and pulling it over his shoulders. They made slow, painful progress across the battlefield. Behind them, they could hear German voices growing closer. The Panther had moved past Iron Betty and was continuing its advance, but infantry was clearing the area building by building. They'd covered perhaps 100 yards when the ammunition in Iron Betty began cooking off. The first explosions were small, sharp cracks. Then came the larger detonations as the main gun shells went up. The fuel tanks ignited, and Iron Betty became a towering column of flame and smoke. The explosion caught several German soldiers in its blast radius, and the burning hulk created a temporary obstacle that forced the German advance to slow and regroup. Jimmy and Webb kept moving, driven by adrenaline and determination. They could see friendly positions ahead, American troops establishing a defensive line at the village edge. A squad of infantry came out to help them, laying down covering fire as they brought the two tankers in. Medics immediately went to work on Webb's leg and the various wounds both men had sustained. As Jimmy sat against a stone wall catching his breath and watching medics work, he saw the rest of Iron Betty's crew. Lou was being loaded onto an ambulance, but he was conscious and gave Jimmy a weak thumbs up. Heavy, Chen, and Santos were battered but alive, already being checked by medical personnel. Captain Hayes appeared, his face a mixture of relief and sorrow. "Iron Betty bought us the time we needed. The company's withdrawn successfully, minimal casualties thanks to your crew." "The tank, sir?" Webb asked from where he lay. "Gone. But your crew's alive, Lieutenant. That's what matters." Later, as the adrenaline faded and the full weight of what they'd been through settled on them, the crew of Iron Betty gathered in a field hospital tent. Lou's wounds, while serious, weren't life-threatening, and the doctors said he'd recover. Santos and Webb would both need some time to heal, but they'd be all right. Heavy Morrison looked at Jimmy and said, "You know, Thornton, I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For laughing at your Field-Weld fix. That repair held through everything. Without it, we'd never have been able to cover that withdrawal. That track held up through combat, evasive maneuvers, and everything else we threw at it." Chen nodded in agreement. "He's right. That repair saved our lives, and probably saved a lot of other lives too." Even Lou, from his hospital bed, managed to smile. "I guess sometimes the crazy ideas are the ones that work." Jimmy looked at his crewmates, these men he'd fought alongside, nearly perished with, and ultimately survived with. "It wasn't just the repair," he said, "it was all of us. We made it because we trusted each other and did our jobs." Webb, his leg bandaged and elevated, raised a canteen of water. "To Iron Betty's crew and to field repairs that nobody believed in." They all raised whatever drink they had. "To Iron Betty," they echoed. The story of Iron Betty's last stand became something of a legend in the 2nd Armored Division. The tale of the laughed-at repair that held through the most desperate fight, enabling one Sherman to cover an entire company's retreat, was told and retold. But for the crew themselves, the real lesson wasn't about improvisation or mechanical ingenuity, though those were important. It was about trust, about standing together when everything seemed impossible, about making the hard choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. In the broader sweep of World War II, Iron Betty's stand was a small moment, barely a footnote in the massive campaigns that swept across Europe. But for the men of that company, for the tankers and infantry who made it back to American lines that day, it was everything. War historians would later analyze the action at Saint-Maurice-au-Forge as a successful delaying action, noting how a single tank had managed to hold off superior forces long enough to allow a larger unit to withdraw intact. Military engineers would study Jimmy's field repair, using it as an example of the kind of creative problem-solving that could mean the difference between success and failure in combat conditions. But Jimmy Thornton, when he finally made it home to Ohio after the war ended, didn't talk much about the repair itself. When pressed by curious neighbors about his time in the service, he'd usually just say that he'd been part of a good crew, and that when people trusted each other and did their jobs, amazing things could happen. He went back to working in his family's machine shop, applying the same principles of creative problem-solving he'd learned during the war. And if someone brought him a particularly challenging repair job, something that seemed impossible, he'd often smile and say, "Well, let's see what we can cobble together." Heavy Morrison returned to the steel mills of Pittsburgh, but he stayed in touch with his crewmates. Every year, on the anniversary of their stand at Saint-Maurice-au-Forge, he'd raise a glass of whiskey and remember the day Iron Betty made her last fight. Danny Chen went back to California and his family's restaurant. He rarely spoke about the war, but he kept a photograph of Iron Betty's crew on the wall behind the counter. When asked about it, he'd simply say they were good friends who'd been through difficult times together. Lou Dexter recovered from his wounds, though he carried scars for the rest of his life. He returned to Detroit and the automobile industry, eventually becoming a shop foreman. He was known for being tough but fair, and for having an unusual willingness to listen when workers proposed unconventional solutions to problems. Sometimes, he'd say, the crazy ideas are the ones that save your life. Eddie Santos went home to Texas, to the ranch where he'd grown up. He was quieter than ever after the war, but those who knew him well said he seemed at peace. He'd done his duty, survived when survival seemed impossible, and come home to the land he loved. Lieutenant Marcus Webb stayed in the Army after the war, eventually rising to the rank of colonel. He became known for his willingness to trust his subordinates' expertise and for supporting innovative solutions to tactical problems. In his office, he kept a photograph of Iron Betty and her crew, a reminder of the day when improvisation, trust, and courage had made all the difference. The field repair that everyone laughed at, the cobbled-together fix that should have failed, became a symbol of something larger. It represented the American soldier's ability to improvise, to make do with what was available, to find solutions when the rule book said there were none. But more than that, it represented the human spirit's refusal to accept defeat, the determination to keep fighting when the odds seemed impossible, and the power of a group of individuals who trusted each other completely. Years after the war, a military historian interviewed the survivors of Iron Betty's crew for a book about armored warfare. He asked Jimmy why he thought the repair had worked when everyone believed it would fail. Jimmy considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I think," he said slowly, "it worked because it had to. We needed it to work, and we believed it would, even when nobody else did. Sometimes that's enough." The historian pressed further. "But technically, what made the difference? The design? The materials? Your welding technique?" Jimmy smiled. "All of that, sure. But mostly, I think it was because every member of that crew needed it to work, and we all did our part to make sure it did. I kept the track together. Santos drove with care even under fire. Webb positioned us to minimize stress on the repair. It wasn't just about the metal and the welds. It was about all of us working together. That perhaps is the real story of Iron Betty and her Field-Weld link fix. It's not just about a mechanical repair that defied expectations, though it was that. It's not just about a heroic last stand that saved lives, though it was that too. It's about human beings under the most extreme pressure, facing impossible odds, choosing to trust each other and do their duty. It's about finding solutions when none seem to exist, about refusing to give up even when giving up would be easier and perhaps more rational. It's about ordinary men, a farm boy who could weld, a school teacher turned officer, a steel worker, a restaurant worker, a factory man, and a rancher who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet them. They didn't set out to be heroes. They set out to fix a broken track, to do their jobs, to get through another day of war. But in doing so, they became something more. They became a testament to what people can accomplish when they work together, trust each other, and refuse to accept failure. The battlefield at Saint-Maurice-au-Forge has long since been cleared. The burned-out wrecks have been removed, the craters filled, the fields returned to peaceful purposes, the village rebuilt, and life moved on, as life always does. But the story endures. It's told in military academies as an example of tactical flexibility. It's cited in engineering courses as a case study in field repairs. It's remembered by the families of the men who served together, passed down as a reminder of what their fathers and grandfathers did in that distant war. And perhaps most importantly, it's remembered by those who were there, by the men who lived it and those who benefited from it. For them, it will always be more than a story. It will always be the day when everything seemed lost, when the odds were impossible, when any rational person would have given up. And yet they didn't. They stayed. They fought. They trusted each other and that cobbled-together repair that nobody believed in. And they made it home. That's the story of Iron Betty. That's the story of the Field-Weld link fix that everyone laughed at, right up until the moment it saved their lives. In the end, war is full of stories like this. Moments of improvisation and innovation, of courage and sacrifice, of human beings pushed to their limits and finding ways to exceed them. Some of these stories are famous, known to everyone. Others, like Iron Betty's last stand, are known only to those who were there and those who take the time to remember. But every one of these stories matters. Every act of courage, every moment of ingenuity, every sacrifice made and life saved matters. They remind us of what people are capable of when everything is on the line. They remind us that sometimes the solutions nobody believes in are the ones that work. That sometimes staying when you could leave is the right choice. That sometimes a group of ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things. That's what Jimmy Thornton and the crew of Iron Betty taught us. Not through speeches or grand gestures, but through their actions on a cold November day in 1944 in a small French village that most people have never heard of. They showed us that belief matters, trust matters, courage matters, and sometimes, just sometimes, a Field-Weld link fix made from scavenged parts and sheer determination can make all the difference in the world. The Sherman tank, for all its flaws and limitations, became one of the most iconic vehicles of World War II. It wasn't the most heavily armored or the most powerfully armed, but it was reliable, produced in vast numbers, and operated by crews who learned to maximize its strengths and work around its weaknesses. Iron Betty was just one Sherman among thousands, her crew just one among tens of thousands. But in their moment, in their fight, they embodied everything that made the Sherman and its crews formidable. Not superior technology or overwhelming firepower, but adaptability, determination, and teamwork. As the sun set on that November day in 1944, as the crew of Iron Betty sat in their field hospital tent, battered but alive, they didn't know that they'd become a story. They were just grateful to have made it through, grateful to be together, grateful for one more day. That's all any of them ever wanted. Not glory or recognition, just the chance to do their jobs, to take care of each other, and to make it home. They got that chance because of a lot of things: skill, luck, courage, and yes, a Field-Weld link fix that held when it shouldn't have. In the years after the war, whenever veterans of Iron Betty's company gathered for reunions, someone would inevitably tell the story. Each telling would add a few details, polish the narrative a bit more, make the odds seem even more impossible than they were. But the core of the story never changed. A repair that nobody believed in, a stand that shouldn't have succeeded, a crew that refused to give up, and a day when everything that could go wrong did, except for the one thing that mattered most. They survived together. That's the story. That's what happened on that November day when they laughed at the Field-Weld link fix, right up until a Sherman covered the retreat alone. It's a story about war, yes, about tanks and tactics and the brutal arithmetic of combat, but more than that, it's a story about people, about the capacity of human beings to face impossible situations and find a way through, about the power of trust and teamwork and refusing to accept defeat. It's a story worth remembering, not just for what happened, but for what it represents: the triumph of determination over adversity, the victory of improvisation over impossibility, the power of belief even when nobody else believes. And perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder that we never really know which solutions will work until we try them, that the ideas everyone laughs at might be the ones that save lives, that unconventional thinking, backed by skill and determination, can overcome even the longest odds. That's the legacy of Iron Betty and her crew. That's the lesson of the Field-Weld link fix. And that's why, more than 80 years later, we still tell this story and remember the men who lived it. They were ordinary men who did extraordinary things. They were a crew who became a family. They were soldiers who stood their ground when withdrawal would have been easier, who trusted each other completely, and who made it home to tell the tale. And it all started with a repair that everybody laughed at until it mattered most. That's the story. That's what we remember. That's why Iron Betty and her crew will never be forgotten.